"I sold your horse farm, Mom. You won't need it anymore." Her voice was ice, and just like that, everything I built vanished. But what she didn't know was that my late husband left one secret she could never sell. This is how I got everything back and made her face it all. The line went dead, but I didn't lower the phone. My hand, holding a bread knife, simply froze mid-slice. Sunlight cut across the kitchen table, the old clock on the wall ticking loudly in the sudden, crushing silence. It wasn't just her words, it was the polished chill in her voice, smooth and expensive like the watch I'd bought her for graduation. A tremor started in my fingers. The blade quivered against the bread. Then, something inside me went quiet. Cold. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft click. She took my farm. She didn't know what I would take back. Every cell in my body screamed. But my hand had stopped shaking. My hands built her future. Clay under the nails, dust settled into every line like a map of the years I'd spent hunched over a spinning wheel, so she would never have to. After the call, after the silence, I walked out of the kitchen and into my studio. The air here was different, thick with the smell of wet earth and drying glaze, a scent that was once the smell of home, of comfort. Now it smelled like the scene of a crime, a life stolen. I sat at my wheel, the wooden stool groaning under my weight. I didn't turn it on. I just rested my hands on a cold, damp lump of clay, the last batch I had prepared before my world was reduced to the dial tone of a disconnected call. My hands paid for an education that taught her to be ashamed of them. The memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. Julia, home for Christmas break during her final year of architecture school. She stood in the doorway of the studio, a silhouette of city-forged perfection against the rustic chaos of my life. She wore a black cashmere coat and sharp, impractical heels that sank slightly into the dusty floorboards. I had moved toward her, my own clothes smudged with terracotta, my hands wet with slurry. "Honey, you're here." The hug was a careful calculation on her part, a precise maneuver to embrace me without truly touching me, to acknowledge the mother without accepting the potter. I could smell her perfume, something crisp and floral, a fragrance designed to cover up any trace of the earth I worked with. She pulled back and glanced around, her eyes scanning the shelves of drying pots and bisque-fired sculptures. "It's just like I remember," she'd said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a judgment. She saw dirt. I saw the foundation of her entire life, built piece by painstaking piece. I centered the clay on the wheel now, the motion instinctive, forceful. The machine hummed to life, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor. My hands enveloped the clay, pressing, guiding, transforming. That shame cost me more than just my pride. It cost me my finest work. For her graduation, I sold the Heron collection, 7 tall, elegant vases I had spent a year perfecting, each one a testament to a form I had struggled with and finally mastered. I told myself it was just pottery. I lied. It was a piece of my soul sold to a collector in Chicago so that my daughter could have a piece of metal and glass on her wrist. We were at a restaurant with white tablecloths and whispering waiters. I slid the velvet box across the table. Her gasp was a sound of pure, unadulterated want. She lifted the watch, its gold band catching the candlelight, and her face was illuminated with a joy so brilliant it almost blinded me to the truth. She clipped it onto her wrist, turning her hand back and forth, admiring the way it shone. Her smile was aimed at the watch, not at me. But I was so desperate for her happiness that I mistook the reflection for the source. I thought it was a fair trade, a foolish one. I gave her a watch. My husband gave me a warning. The wheel spun under my hands, the clay rising into a cylinder, smooth and yielding. Robert always saw the things I chose to ignore. He saw people for the materials they were made of, not for the glaze they presented to the world. Later that graduation night, after Julia had gone to bed, we sat by the fireplace. The new watch was gone from her wrist, tucked safely in its box upstairs, but its phantom gleam still hung in the air between us. Robert had been quiet all evening, observing. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the firelight dancing on its surface. He watched me, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "She was happy, wasn't she?" I'd asked, needing his validation. He reached over and put his warm, solid hand over mine. He didn't answer my question directly. Instead, he said, "I saw the way you looked at those vases before you packed them up, Martha." That was real. He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. That thing on her wrist, it's just a way of telling time, and time is something it can't buy back for you. He looked at me then, his eyes holding the full weight of his love and his concern. Gold is bright, Martha, but it doesn't keep you warm. Robert's words hung in the air long after the memory faded, a cold comfort in the humming silence of the studio. The clay on the wheel had become a tall, featureless cylinder, a foundation for nothing. My work was interrupted by a sharp, formal rap on the studio door. Through the dusty glass, I saw a silver sedan parked in my gravel driveway, so clean and out of place it looked like a spaceship had landed amongst the trees. I wiped my hands on my apron, the damp clay leaving faint streaks of red. The man at the door was dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed vacuum-sealed onto him. He was young, with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes, and shoes that were far too expensive for a dusty workshop. "Martha Evans?" he asked, his eyes flicking past me to the shelves of pottery with a flicker of polite disinterest. He didn't offer a hand. "I am," I said. "My name is Michael Davies. I'm an associate with Sterling and Thorne. I represent your daughter, Julia." He extended a sleek leather briefcase, placing it on my cleanest work table as if it were a bomb. The clasps clicked open with unnerving precision. He spoke about asset liquidation, fiduciary duties, and market rate valuations. The words were a fog, a smokescreen of legalese designed to obscure the simple, brutal truth. He slid a thick sheaf of papers across the table. On top was a power of attorney document granting Julia absolute control over all my properties and accounts. And at the bottom, a signature. My signature. It was my name. It was not my hand. My voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos erupting inside me. "This is a forgery." The lawyer, Davies, simply smiled that empty smile again. "The signature has been legally notarized and filed, Miss Evans. According to the state, it is your hand." He started packing his briefcase, his work already done. Julia and her fiancé, David, felt it was best to handle these matters efficiently. To save you the stress, David, a name I barely knew, the boyfriend she'd brought home once, a man with a handshake that was too firm and eyes that were always assessing the room. He wasn't just a boyfriend, he was a partner. After the silver car disappeared down the road, I didn't crumble. The shock was too deep for that. I washed my hands, the clay swirling down the drain in a muddy spiral, and drove into town. I needed to see it for myself. I walked into the local bank, the same one Robert and I had used for 40 years. The teller, Susan, greeted me with her usual warm smile. "Just a standard withdrawal, Martha?" she asked, already reaching for the familiar paperwork. "Yes, please," I said. I watched her smile falter as she stared at her computer screen. She typed, clicked, and then typed again. A small frown creased her forehead. "That's odd," she murmured, avoiding my eyes. "There seems to be a hold on the account, Martha." A flag from the corporate office for a paperwork discrepancy. A paperwork discrepancy. The same kind of clean corporate language the lawyer used. It wasn't a mistake. It was a barricade. I was being locked out of my own life, one perfectly legal document at a time. I stood there in the quiet, familiar bank, and for the first time, felt like a complete stranger. I walked out into the afternoon sun. The denial slip from the teller crumpled in my fist. They had been so thorough, so professional. They left me with nothing, a calculated mistake. The account wasn't just on hold, it was frozen solid. This wasn't a coincidence or a bureaucratic error. This was a move. I drove home from the bank in a haze of calculated silence. The world outside my car window seemed distant, unreal. When I stepped back into the house, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was heavy with the presence of my daughter's betrayal. Every object she had ever touched, every photograph of her smiling face on the mantelpiece, felt like a lie. I was a ghost in my own home, a curator of a museum of forgeries. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. Despair was a dead end. What I needed was a weapon. And in a war you didn't know you were fighting, you searched for the armory you didn't know you had. My search led me to Robert's old office, a small wood-paneled room at the back of the studio that I hadn't truly entered in the 2 years since he'd been gone. I had kept the door closed, preserving it as it was, a shrine of grief. Now I opened it as an archaeologist entering a tomb. The air was still, thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the faint, lingering smell of his pipe tobacco. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the window. His desk was neat. His books were ordered. Robert was a man of quiet, meticulous systems. I started there. I pulled open drawers, sifting through old tax returns, property deeds, and business ledgers, looking for any loophole, any asset Julia's polished lawyer might have missed. There was nothing. They had been as thorough as I had feared. I sank into his worn leather chair, the leather cracking in protest. My hand idly traced the edge of the desk, my fingers dipping into the deep bottom drawer. It was empty, except my fingers brushed against something in the back corner. Taped to the underside of the drawer top was a small, flat key. I almost missed it. It was for the old wooden chest at the foot of his bookshelf, a chest I'd always assumed just held old university textbooks. My heart began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I unlocked the chest. Inside, there was no secret ledger, no hidden stash of cash. There was only a small, hand-carved box made of walnut, the first thing he ever made for me in his woodshop. My thumb traced the familiar worn grain. I lifted the lid. It held no jewels or gold, just a single silver USB flash drive. I stared at it for a long moment, this tiny piece of modern technology nestled in a relic of our past. I took it to his old desktop computer. The machine whirred to life with a slow, grinding groan, the screen flickering on like a reluctant ghost. I inserted the drive. One folder appeared. Its name was simply, "For Martha." I clicked. It was filled with video files dated methodically. I chose the most recent one. The screen filled with my husband's face. He looked tired, older than I remembered, but his eyes were clear and direct as he spoke to the small camera on his desk. "Martha," he began, his voice filling the silent room. "If you're watching this, it means I was right to be worried." "And I am so sorry," he explained everything. His suspicions about David's influence, about Julia's growing distance. He told me he'd created an entirely separate trust, an intricate financial structure outside of our estate, funded years ago. He had moved the true value of our life's work into it, leaving the farm and the accounts as a shell. A decoy, he called it. My husband didn't leave me a fortune, he left me a fortress. Then I clicked on another file, dated 6 months before Robert's death. The view was from a small, hidden camera, aimed at his desk chair from the bookshelf. The quality was grainy. Julia was sitting in his chair, David leaning over her shoulder. They were laughing. I watched as David guided her hand, practicing my signature on a blank piece of paper. "See? Looser on the M," he said, his voice a smug murmur. "Your mother's hand is from clay, not a keyboard." "It has to feel natural." Julia giggled, a sound so carefree it curdled my blood. "She'll never see it coming," she said. "She trusts me completely." I watched. I listened. I learned. My husband left a secret. It was on record. On the screen, my daughter was looking at a forgery of my name, her face alight with triumph. She had no idea she was being recorded. I slept in Robert's office that night, if you could call it sleep. It was a state of suspended animation, a long, dark vigil kept with the ghost of my husband and the digital specter of my daughter's betrayal. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through the dusty window, I didn't feel tired. I felt a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. I knew what I had to do. I didn't look for a number online. I went to Robert's old Rolodex, a relic from a time when trust was built on handshakes, not hyperlinks. I found the card for Alistair Finch, an attorney in the city. The card was worn, the ink faded. Robert had trusted him. That was enough for me. I dialed the number, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. A calm, measured voice answered on the second ring. Alistair Finch. Mr. Finch, I began, my own voice sounding foreign, steadier than it had in weeks. My name is Martha Evans. My late husband, Robert, was a client of yours. There was no surprise in his voice, only a patient warmth. Mrs. Evans, I've been expecting your call for 2 years. Robert left very specific instructions, tears I didn't know I had pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was not the time for grief. This was the time for strategy. I told him everything. The phone call from Julia, the lawyer, the forged signature, the frozen accounts. I listened as he told me about the impenetrable trust Robert had built, a financial fortress with walls so high and deep that Julia's legal maneuvers were like throwing pebbles at a mountain. And then came the words that rebuilt my world on a new, unshakable foundation. Rest assured, Martha, he said, his voice a calm anchor in my storm. Nothing has been lost. Everything is still yours. It always was. That was the only declaration of war I needed. There were no angry letters sent, no tearful phone calls made to my daughter. There was only the quiet, efficient work of undoing her betrayal. Under Mr. Finch's guidance, I uploaded the video files to a secure server. I signed real documents, my own hand creating my own signature, which he dispatched to nullify the forgeries. Each action was a silent, invisible move on the board, dismantling her attack piece by piece. Days turned into a week. I went back to my studio. I worked. My hands, which had trembled with shock, were now sure and steady on the clay. I was not a victim waiting for rescue. I was a woman reclaiming her life, one rotation of the wheel at a time. Then my phone rang. It was Julia. Her voice was tight, laced with an irritation she couldn't hide. "Mom, something's wrong," she said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "The title transfer on the farm is being held up. There's a legal challenge from some trust I've never heard of." I kept my voice even, placid. "Oh, is there? That sounds complicated." "Complicated? It's costing us money, Mom. My lawyer is looking into it." "I'm sure he'll figure it out," I said, and then I ended the call. The true victory, however, came from a place I never expected. 2 weeks later, I was in the kitchen, the local evening news playing softly on the small television on the counter. I was glazing a new pot when a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. I looked up. A photo of David, Julia's fiancé, filled the screen. He was being led from his downtown office in handcuffs. The reporter spoke of securities fraud, a Ponzi scheme, and a federal investigation that had been going on for months. All his assets, the report said, had been frozen. I put down my brush. I watched the footage, my face impassive. There was no joy, no sense of righteous satisfaction. There was only the cold, quiet acknowledgement of a strategic reality. The architect of my daughter's greed, the engine of her ambition, had been removed from the board by a completely different game. He was out. His money was gone. And Julia was alone. I didn't start a war. I just ended hers. I looked out the kitchen window at the darkening sky. A line of storm clouds was moving across the horizon, but they were heading east, away from me. The storm had changed direction, and it was no longer aimed at me. I didn't have to wait long. A few days after David's face was plastered on the news, the sound of a taxi skidding to a halt on my gravel driveway tore through the afternoon quiet. I was in the studio, my hand steadying the wall of a large pot on the wheel. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on my work, my rhythm even, as the door burst open. It was Julia, but it was a version of her I had never seen before. The polished architect was gone, stripped away to reveal someone raw and frayed. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, as if she'd slept in them. Her hair was a mess, and her mascara had left dark, tear-stained tracks down her pale cheeks. She looked like a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own life. She brought the frantic, sour smell of the city's panic into my calm, earthy space. "Mom." Her voice was a ragged whisper. She looked around the studio, at me, at the solid, real things I was creating, as if she couldn't comprehend how my world was still standing when hers had been obliterated. "They took everything," she choked out, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "David's accounts are frozen. The lawyers won't even take my calls anymore. The firm, they let me go. I have nothing. It's all gone." I kept the wheel spinning, my hands gently shaping the rising clay. I remained silent. My silence was a wall she couldn't scale, and it made her desperate. She rushed forward, stopping just short of the wheel, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mom, you have to help me." The whisper became a plea, high and thin. "The farm, the assets, they're still in your name, right? The trust? You have to give me something. Please, Mom, save me." There it was, the great reversal. The daughter who had left her mother for dead was now begging for a lifeline. I slowly brought the wheel to a halt. I reached for a cloth and wiped my hands with deliberate, unhurried care. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time I felt no anger, only a deep, profound pity. She had built a palace on sand, and she was mystified that the tide had come in. I finally met her eyes. "What about the watch, Julia?" I asked, my voice quiet. "What?" She looked confused, thrown by the question. I nodded toward her wrist. The gold band was still there, a shackle of her own making. "The watch I bought you." "All that gold. Robert was right, wasn't he? It doesn't keep you warm." Before she could form a reply, another car crunched quietly on the gravel outside. A modest, dark sedan. A man in a simple, well-worn suit stepped out. It was my lawyer, Mr. Finch. He walked to the studio entrance and stood there, a calm, unassuming presence. "Who is that?" Julia demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What is going on?" Mr. Finch didn't look at her. He simply met my gaze and gave me a slight, respectful nod. I returned it. That was the only signal he needed. He stepped inside, holding a slim black tablet. He walked toward Julia. She flinched, taking a step back. He didn't say a word. He simply angled the screen toward her and pressed play. The grainy video filled the tablet. Her own voice, light and cruel, echoed in the quiet studio. "She'll never see it coming," her younger self said on the screen, laughing as David guided her hand. "She trusts me completely." I watched my daughter's face. I saw the flicker of confusion, the flash of angry denial, and then the slow, sickening dawning of comprehension. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a waxy, translucent white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The carefully constructed facade of the victim, of the desperate daughter, shattered into a million pieces. She saw herself for what she was, a thief, a liar. The truth played on screen. Her lies stopped. She sank to the floor, her legs giving out from under her, her eyes still locked on the screen. The sound of her own laughter from the past was the only thing that broke the silence. My lawyer said nothing. He just placed the tablet on the table between us. The sound of my daughter's sobbing was the only thing in the studio. It was a raw, broken sound, the noise of a world completely undone. The video on the tablet had finished, the screen gone dark, but its reflection still swam in the tears on Julia's cheeks. Mr. Finch stood by the door, a silent sentinel of the quiet justice we had just delivered. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, waiting for his instructions, for the final crushing blow. He was waiting for me to tell him to call the police, to press charges for fraud, to have her thrown out of the house she had tried to steal from under me. All the power in the world was mine in that moment, the power to destroy, to banish, to complete my victory. But when I looked at the crumpled figure of my daughter on the floor, I didn't see a villain. I saw the wreckage. I saw a hollowed-out girl who had chased gold until she'd lost her soul, and now the gold was gone, and she had nothing left to trade. What victory was there in grinding the dust of her life under my heel? Robert hadn't built a fortress to protect our money. He'd built it to protect our life, and she, God help her, was a part of that life. "You can leave, Mr. Finch," I said, my voice steady. "We're done here." He nodded once, a gesture of deep understanding, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Julia looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She expected a verdict, a judgment. I walked over to the sink and turned on the tap, the water splashing against the clay-stained basin. "You have nothing," I said, not looking at her. "You can leave with that, or you can stay." I turned off the water and faced her. "If you stay, you work. You will live in the guest room. You will eat the food I cook, and you will learn the value of the dirt you are so ashamed of. You will earn your place here. The choice is yours." The first few weeks were a painful silence. Julia moved like a ghost, her city clothes looking absurdly out of place in the rustic simplicity of the house. I set her up at her own wheel, a block of fresh, wet clay before her, and I watched her fail. For the first time in her life, my brilliant, successful daughter was clumsy, inept. The clay would wobble, collapse, and fold under her inexperienced hands. Her frustration was a palpable thing, a storm cloud in the studio. She, who could design buildings that touched the sky, couldn't shape a simple bowl that would hold water. She swept floors. She mixed glazes, her manicured nails chipping and cracking. Her expensive clothes became stained with the earth. She didn't speak, and I didn't push her. I would show her a technique once, how to center the clay, how to pull the walls, and then I would return to my own work, leaving her to struggle with the lesson. I wasn't teaching her how to make a perfect pot. I was teaching her how to start over when everything falls apart. The breakthrough came a month later. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I was glazing a set of mugs when I heard a small, choked sound from her side of the studio. I looked over. She was staring at a small, lopsided bowl on her wheel. It was thick, uneven, and far from perfect. But it was standing. It hadn't collapsed. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with an emotion I hadn't seen since she was a little girl who had just learned to ride her bike. It was pride. Small, fragile, but real. I walked over and picked it up. My thumb traced a crack near the rim. "The wall is thin here," I said softly. "It's flawed." I met her gaze. "But it's the flaws that prove it was made by a human hand. It's what makes it real." We work together now, side by side. The silence has become easier, filled with the gentle hum of the wheels and the scrape of tools. Today, we are working on a large urn, a piece that requires 4 hands to steady it. My wrinkled, knowing hands guide the form, while hers, still learning but growing stronger, provide the support. They are both covered in the same gray clay. We are not rebuilding what we lost. That house is gone forever. We are building something new, from the ground up. We've learned that not every pot comes out of the kiln whole. Sometimes it's the cracks that show it has survived the fire. Thank you so much for being here and listening to a piece of my heart today. We all have family stories that shape us, and if you feel comfortable, I would be honored to read yours in the comments. If you'd like to share in more stories like this, please subscribe. It would mean the world.